Hello, welcome to today's lecture, How to Combat Your Russian Accent. I am Stephen Ligoff from INTESOL Russia, here to train you today on fighting niggling bits of Runglish that infest your speech and those of your students. Today, I hope I can help you be not only a better teacher, but a better speaker of English. And so, I hope you're taking notes at home. If you're not taking notes, then you can just watch me make fun of myself for about an hour. So, let's get started. Now, the first thing we have to talk about, realistically, is what is Runglish. Now, Runglish and rungling, which is my new favorite verb, is speaking English but with a heavily Russian-centered accent. Now, we always have these problems. They come up regularly in conversations between teachers. I myself am a teacher of English, even though I don't look like it. And my description that has been given is one of international relations and ethnography. Well, ethnography is really good for this because it helps you hone in on the problems inherent within the ethnic groups that generate these linguistic problems. So, today we are going to look at Runglish, as in badly spoken English by Russians, and try and tear it apart piece by piece and understand what goes wrong, how to fix it, and how to pass on this information to your students, or to keep you in the loop so that you may constantly better yourself as an English speaker. Now, before we begin, let me just tell you that we are accepting questions all through this. And even though I look scary, I'm actually very cute. Look at the cheeks. And you can ask absolutely anything. We are going to have time for questions as they come. They will get sorted and I will respond to them in various chunks throughout the presentation in which we can discuss some niggling questions you have. So, let's properly begin. Now, the first thing to understand about English is it's very, very forgiving. Now, there is an anxiety among Russian teachers and Russian speakers that they are going to be ridiculed for their English. And this, I'm sorry, is almost always true, because English people are not very nice people. But they are also very forgiving. English is an international language. There are speakers, there are second language speakers that number almost as many as the native speakers, and depending on who you ask, sometimes even more. Indians, Chinese, Africans, Central Americans, other Europeans are all going to be speaking a level of English that will be ridiculed by English speakers. I'm sorry. But here's the thing. Don't worry about it. Not only is it something unavoidable, but it's usually almost never a problem. And what do I mean by that? Very simply, your accent isn't as bad as you think. As said here, you speak English, and I can almost guarantee, with quite an accent. It's quite heavy. That's never the problem. The problem is clarity through that accent. And today we are going to be working on fixing that clarity and the problems inherent within. Everyone will know that you're Russian, almost always. I've been here for 1 year and 5 days now, and I have only ever met one Russian person who has ever completely destroyed their accent. She spent 6 years studying in the UK. There you go. So, don't worry. You can't fix it completely, and it's not a problem if you don't. Just let's have that preface as we continue. And to be frank, it's not your fault. I want you to read this again and again and again and again and again. A lot of my students despair, and the ones that I've had over the years, they constantly tell me, Stephen, why do I not sound English? Why is my accent holding me back? Why do I still sound like I come from Murmansk and stumble over every third word? Now, Russian and English are in different language groups. One is High Germanic, and the other is quite obviously Slavic. Now, there's a lot of complicated, wiggly stuff, we'll call it, in the hope of sounding very professional. There's lots of wiggly stuff even within language groups. Russians are going to have a little bit of a tough time pronouncing Polish for the first time. Germans are going to have a problem pronouncing English. Russian and English exist on completely opposite ends of the European language group structure. And so, not only are the sounds different, not only is the writing different, not only is the language, the grammatical constructs different, the muscles we use to speak it are inherently different. Two completely different muscle groups. English as a language involves the entire mouth, and I am sorry that I'm speaking in English for the majority of this, for the totality of this presentation. I simply am very bad at Russian. But in English, we use the whole mouth, and we go from the back to the front, and we stretch and speak loudly and project our voice, and with each coming word structure, every bit of our mouth is in motion. Russian is inherently the opposite. When I first started learning Russian, I was told quite pointedly, make your mouth as small as possible, voice almost everything, and just kind of use your tongue and your lips to do the rest. It is a very subtle, beautiful, and I would call it liquid language. It flows marvelously, you pronounce every letter, and everything is produced in the front of the mouth. As opposed to English, which is very brutal, guttural, short, and banal in the way that you master the mouth movement. So for Russians, as the inherent problem of moving past of the tiny mouth and the tiny inflection of sound and that beautiful little bit of credence to detail and attention, that's completely lost in English. So, a couple things to understand. You were born being bad at speaking English. It is not your fault that you've not managed to beat the accent. Because, and as I mentioned before, English people understand this. English is a hard language. They are going to accept you. Let's move on to some actual lessons. Understand that these two things I'm sure you've seen before. This is on the left-hand side of the screen, is the unvoiced dental fricative, and on the left is on the right is the voiced dental fricative. These are consonant phonemes produced in the International Phonetic Alphabet. You've all seen this language, you've all used it as teachers, I hope. You've all used this as students, perhaps. They're awful. They're great for if you're a linguist trying to understand language construct and phonetic and diphthong detail and mesh. You're a teacher, you don't need them. And today we're not going to talk about them. I could sit here for hours and talk to you about muscle groups and how to correctly work each tendon in your mouth and understand how that relates to a phonetic alphabet. Too complicated. They're terrible, they're complex, and they whittle you down as a learner. We're going to do this simply, we're going to do it easily, and let's start with the easiest one to tackle. But before we start with that, I want to ask a few questions. First, I assume there are already a few questions here, which I'm going to answer. There is a 40-second delay on the video feed, so I will give you some time to answer this. What are your most troubling bits of accent to wiggle out from? I want to hear your horror stories with accent, if that's all right. And we're going to take a little bit of time before we get into the meat and the nitty-gritty of our presentation, starting with how to combat your rolling Russian R's. Let's hear your questions. And we're just going to give it about 30 seconds in case any of you are shy and have no questions, and that's perfectly fine. And we can just move on with the presentation, if that is the case. And are we going to call it there? Yep, okay. We'll call it there. If you have any questions that you're currently typing, because I didn't give you enough time, please still put them through. I will answer them in the next question slot. But let's go forward properly with the rolling R. So this is a very common one in the West. Do remember, if you are following along at home, maybe write some of these down. Almost all of the lessons that I'm going to give to you today are going to have a companion exercise. All of them are good practice, and we're going to talk about why now. So, the rolling R. So I grew up speaking a mixture of Yiddish, Hebrew, and Afrikaans. All three of them, thank God, have the rolling R. And so when I first came to Russia and got a Russian tutor, the first thing they tried to teach me was how to roll my R's. And I mastered it. It was beautiful. The problem is, in English, they don't have the rolling R. And it is an immediate identification that you are a foreigner if you cannot master your R's. I say that. It's almost a complete lie. In English, there are two kinds of R's. There's the rhotic, which sounds so nice, rhotic. Brilliant. And the non-rhotic R's. Now, the rhotic R's are those that you pronounce. It makes you sound a little bit American or West Country English. These are the things where if you're learning American English, you are really going to have to hammer home because they love to pronounce their R's. And this is something that you will have hammered home. You hear your ear year after year. On the opposite end, you have the non-rhotic R. The non-rhotic R is the one that I'm used to. It is used in Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, and most of England. This is the one where you hear your ear year after year becomes you hear your ear year after year. And you replace the R sound with the air. That's fine. The problem is, although I would always stress that you utilize British English and more precisely English when you're learning English or when you're teaching English because it is a more refined manner of speaking and will earn you as a second language speaker a bit more credence throughout your conversations with native speakers. The simple fact is that most of our resources will come from the United States. And a lot of the people you will speak to will come from the United States. A lot of the media you'll consume will come from the United States. And so it is imperative to work on the rhotic R. This is hard. Usually, this is something ignored in Russian schools. Here, we are going to teach you a very simple method. The method is built on muscle acclimatization. As I mentioned before, English and Russian exist on completely separate I suppose, planes of pronunciation. They don't mesh well together because the muscles don't mesh. And all it is to train your accent is locate those muscles, isolate them, and like any other muscle, exercise them. And with that exercise, here's the first one. I want you to repeat after me. It is going to be weird. I do apologize, but we're going to do it anyway. So, repeat after me. Swing, ring. Swing, ring. Swing, ring. Swing, ring. Quite a simple rhyme. I want you to speed it up as you go. Swing, ring, swing, ring, swing, ring, and dive into running. Swing, ring, swing, ring, swing, ring, swing, ring, running. This is something that tricks your muscles on your third or fourth try into locking into that forward motion that produces the rhotic R. The rhotic R is, of course, produced right at the front of the mouth. The r. You purse your lips and you just voice through it. This r, I can't even do it well. I'm not gonna lie. Is an an easy thing to produce, but only if you force it through. This is wonderful practice for locating those muscles, feeling where you can make it from, the r right at the front of the mouth, and then moving forward in how to build upon its further use in your life. I would recommend trying the swing, ring, swing, ring, swing, ring before you have to read any R-related tongue twisters. And we're going to get to one of those in just a moment, just after lesson number 2. Boop. The tricky, sneaky H. Now, H is a difficult letter. It, of course, occurs all over the European language structure, of course, appearing in Russian as a N. Sorry. But for the H in English, even then it's got a tricky identity. We can't even say it properly when we speak in English. It goes A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. It's not a H. But we ignore it and pretend like it's normal. But here's the thing. When Russians pronounce the H, it almost always comes as a because the closest thing that Russians have to the H is the letter that appears in English as an X, the and so Russians, of course, when trying to speak English, and rightly so, are trying to engage more muscles in their speech because, of course, English is a much more muscle-heavy language, as we discussed. They will always put a bit too much strain on the H. Always you will get, "Hi, how are you?" And you sound like you're from the Kavkaz. But it is a traditionally assigned Russian thing when you have the, what do you call them here? The klukva, with the Soviets, the angry Soviets in American television. They will always go, "I have you now, Mr. Bond." So here, very simply, I'm going to tell you to ignore it. Because it's not really a letter. It hardly makes a sound and requires absolutely no voice. If any of you are confused as to what I mean by voice, I've said it quite a few times now, the voice is the produced in the back of your throat. It is the hum that produces most language. It is used a lot more sparingly in English. About a third of our letters are unvoiced and are just produced with air. Russian always has a very slight voice going through it. But H is unvoiced. So simply, it is a breath. How are you? It is a slightly elongated sigh allowed to build the next vowel or consonant that follows it. Even when used in the middle of a word, where. Where just gives a little bit more flexibility and weight to the W. It's hardly even a letter. It sometimes will function in the way of a mekiznak in Russian, but oftentimes, when it takes prominence in lieu of how and hi, then it needs a bit more attention. Now here is something to exercise it and understand how it just bleeds through in a sentence. So looking here, I'm going to just highlight here on point number 2. Shall we call it a point? We'll call it point number 2. Repeat after me. How highly howls here helps. All of those are hardly, another one, hardly voiced at all. It is simply a sharp breath. And I know it's difficult to understand that a letter doesn't sound like a letter. This is why we practice. And now, we get to practice. I think that's the next slide. It is not. It is the slide after this one. I didn't say I'd be very good at this, at least in real time. So, the W is something that occurs in English quite often. When, where, why. These are three of our basic question words, for example. Something that you will learn as an A1 learner. The V, and of course the W has no counterpart in Russian. This is a problem, especially because it is produced in a similar muscle form to the V. Now, the V is something that you have in Russian. Even though it looks like a B, you're wrong. I know your writing system is older than English, but I'm a supremacist, I'm sorry. So, the V in Russian is ever present, obviously. The problem is, it's not the English V. Now, this is something that is never taught to ESL learners in Russia, as far as I'm aware. I've been to dozens of schools, dozens of companies, and I have never gotten any vindication on this issue. The V in Russian is very soft, right? Very, very soft. One of the greatest tips for accent training I ever got was to pronounce it not as kvass, but kwas. I did that wrong, even on live camera. I'm sorry, everybody, kvass. So it is a lot softer. And so because it's softer and it's something that the Russians think that they know in English, it will almost always bleed into either a W or the W will bleed into the V, right? This is something that we need to address. But here's the thing. It is so simple. It is difficult to remember because, as I said, Russians get used to thinking that they understand the way the English V works. And so they completely destroy the W through that understanding. And as long as you remember that you must do this very simple strategy, you'll have no problems. So if we could just get a little bit of a close-up on me, thank you, please. So, after me. Very, wary. Now, you saw that difference there. Very, wary. The V is always produced with the teeth. V. That drawn-out voicing, that scraping level of consonant is something that English people will come to associate with a good pronunciation. And on the opposite end, wary. No teeth. If your teeth are touching your lips at any, or even the back of your lips, the inside of your mouth, you're doing something wrong and it will come out wrong. Now, a way to understand the difference between this, because I do commiserate with you, it is quite difficult when you first start out, is this pair here that I've presented, the on number 2. Very, wary. Now, this is something I would encourage you to repeat as much as you can. It is a very simple way for understanding how to isolate the movements necessary. And yes, wary, even though it's spelt with an A, is pronounced the same way as very, just by changing the first letter. Let us continue. Finally, we have the practice. I was wondering when we get to this. I wrote this very late at night. So, could we, thank you. So, here we have this. This is a tongue twister that I've, there is a first part to it coming later where we will look at the th and the sounds. Don't worry, we are coming to them, I promise, because they are, of course, the most difficult for Russian learners. Absolutely. People who've been speaking English for 40, 50 years in Russia still sometimes get it wrong. So these are the final 2 lines of a 3-line tongue twister that I've designed to really hurt Russians. Now, let's begin with just testing this out. As we said before, we're starting with running. Swing, ring, swing, ring, swing, ring. Running very fast from various raptors. Harding hardly swam in the river water. And of course, the last line, if we're going to use the rhotic R, Harding hardly swam in the river water. Let's go it again. Running very fast from various raptors. Harding hardly swam in the river water. Now, this is something I would encourage you to repeat, maybe, if you have the time, a few times a night. Quite possibly dividing that up between maybe once every second night. This is simply exercise. It doesn't matter if you pronounce these words 100% right, 100% of the time. It is necessary for you to understand that these are useful purely for exercising the muscles necessary to speak them. So please try this again and again and again. Let's go through. Next, more homework. Now, this is something I would also encourage you to repeat at home. So, swan swam over the pond, swim, swan, swim, swan swam back again, well swum, swan. Now, this with whenever the weather are two very common English nursery rhymes, just to get kids to, pronounce these things correctly within the English-speaking world. I would recommend you use them too, because they are quite simply fantastic for exercising the muscles. My students know these two and the previous one off by heart, and every time I mention a swan or the weather, they'll just burst into them because I've drilled it into them so much. But their accents come out wonderful after the fact. Let's move on. Boop. Hell. And we're here at the voiced and unvoiced dental fricatives, the th and the. Or, well, sorry if I'm going in order, the v and th. Hard. Now, here's the thing. This is difficult for two reasons. Now, you've all encountered this problem. I'm not going to spend too much time explaining why it's bad. You know that this is the worst aspect of the Russian language. This is bad because not only do these two sounds absolutely not appear in the Russian language, but they are so ubiquitous in English and pronounced so quickly using muscles that are never touched in the Russian language in a way that Russians do not speak. The th and v are very pronounced. And we're going to look at why or what that means right now. On your screen, you see my darling colleague, Yulia. She volunteered to look silly during this exercise. Now, she has her index finger on the index finger, forefinger, I think they're the same finger, on the tip of her nose here. And on the other end, I should turn the other way, she has the crook of her thumb just on the crest of her bottom lip. Now, this is what I use. This is a trick that I use for all of my students. And it works really well. Your students are going to look silly. You're going to look silly. But you can look silly together. Kids love doing weird things. With this, it teaches you how to pronounce. And I don't mean pronounce as in pronunciation. I mean pronounce as in come out. Because English has so many words and yet still has two words that sound the same and mean the same thing and is difficult to discuss right now. But Russian, as I mentioned before, is a very polite language. It is very soft, very detailed, and very just on your lips, or just behind your lips, and the very front of your mouth, not with much mouth movement. English is the opposite, and this cannot be seen more than with the, because this is something that requires the teeth and your tongue to come out of your mouth, something Russians are not comfortable with because it's not something they do. Here's the training. With that little triangle thing that Yulia, my lovely assistant, has over there, what we want is your students, when they go th, to have the tip of their tongue touch the tip of their thumb. This will teach them the approximate acceptable distance for pronouncing these two phonemes. Of course, they are difficult and they require a lot of work, which is why we have this. Cloth clothes in these thoughts with those thieves. This is the worst sentence that a Russian speaker can have given to them without fainting. It's terrible. But it covers the two phonemes in a wonderful way. How they play with each other, how they play with different consonants and different vowels. how they respond to complicated word structures. Now, the most difficult thing with any language is understanding the speed and transparency is understanding the speed and the frequency at which you change sounds. Now, this in Russian is something that everyone learning Russian hates because, oh my God, it is impossible to make a foreign transition. We don't talk enough about transition. The transition between letters is a terrible but beautiful thing. It took me, and I counted, 5,377 tries to pronounce "здравствуйте" the right way. I would stand in my shower and just go "здравствуйте, здравствуйте." Because the first time I came to Russia, I met my friend's stepmother at the door. I was trying to say "здравствуйте," and instead I looked at her dead in the eye and went. She must have thought I was brain damaged and responded in perfect English. I will never forget this and never live it down. She is now my boss at INTESOL Russia. Now, INTESOL Russia has a problem with this in that I was first brought on to teach this phoning. Because they could all pronounce it, they couldn't pronounce it in the words. It is not enough for you to sit down and teach your kids how to go th and v without showing them the complicated ways in which it plays into the words. And that's what we're going to do right now. Cloth. Easy. It is the much more simple o sound that is going to be produced. The first time they go it, they'll usually go cloth because they're trying hard to speak the English. Next is something very difficult for Russians and quite possibly the hardest sound transition that will ever be made in English when a Russian is speaking it. Clothes. Now, for this, I would argue for demonstrating to your students a simple transition. Turning this way, turning the wrong way. Okay, everything's a bit backward on the cameras. So, from the back of the throat, clothes. And you need to demonstrate to them and visualize for them the way that works. It is clothes and a quick back so that it is a singular voice that produces both the th and the s, but you're just dropping the th aspect. In these thoughts with those thieves. I would recommend that this is something that you give to your students almost every night for them to do, something for you to do almost every night. Is a fantastic way after just beating it into them, don't actually beat your children, but beating it into them, that this is the way the muscles work. After demonstrating for them the very simple methodology of the th and th with the little fingers, it becomes quite easy for you to show them this next step, for them to understand the way the muscles work, how they bleed into other more complex letter structures to produce sounds that will be noticed in English as the shibboleth, the difference between foreign and native. Also, shibboleth is a delightful word, comes from Hebrew, and it means something that designates you as a foreigner, usually in language. Shibboleth. Beautiful. So, this is also, as I mentioned before, the first line of the tongue twister that we did. I would recommend putting them together. Cloth clothes in these thoughts with those thieves, running very fast from various raptors. Harding hardly swam in the river water. It's great. And without fail, in my solid year of teaching in Russia, it works wonders. All of my students come out with, of course, a Russian accent. As we said, you cannot completely kill it, but pronouncing things wonderfully and almost sounding native in the way that they do so. Let's get on. Boop. Vowel stretching. Now, vowel stretching is one of those things that is quite seldom discussed because it's a very murky phonetic water. Vowel stretching is something that is overly used in Russian. Every one of your vowels will carry a very subtle, very quaint diphthong to it, and if not a diphthong, then just a stretch, or an inflection, or a stress, none of which exists in English. And it means that, of course, Russians develop a very keen ear for detail, But also it's very hard for us to speak Russian because we don't understand why your E and your I are different. Anyway, sorry, vowel stretching. So tighten it up. This is a very simple thing, and we're not going to spend much time on it at all. But there's no elasticity in English. If you want to stretch a vowel to add inflection, you just put more time on it, and you stretch it that way. But there's no dipping, ducking, diving, weaving. And with that, here we have another popular nursery rhyme. I am partially blocking it up with my big head box. I am sorry. But how many berries could a bearberry carry if a bearberry could carry berries? I'm gone now, thank you. Well, they cannot carry berries, which would make you very wary, back to very wary, but a bearberry carried is more scary. Now, that seemed easy to say. Give it to your children. What I would recommend and what I've done before is playing a kind of tag team game between the bears and the berries. And anyway, I'll leave you to design your own classrooms. But this is something that children will have trouble with in speaking English because the vowels here are quite short and quite simple. And this runs in contrast to the Russian pronunciation of what these words would be. For example, instead of berries, it would be berries or bieris. It's a very simple exercise to just kind of teach your students how to tighten it up a little. But as I said, very simple. We don't need to spend much time on it. Very easy to understand and move on. I would even argue that this is the least important aspect because some level of vowel manipulation is inherently understood as being a part of being a foreigner. So don't worry about it. But if you do draw attention to it, I would highly recommend this little nursery rhyme to get your students used to tightening it up. And now, the infamous ing. Now, so often we have Russians saying that they are coming, they are walking, they are going to be there very fast because they are arriving shortly, I am promising. This ing is, of course, indicative of someone who was trying very hard, but this is a foreign sound. Now, I'm also quite interested in, and please ask questions of this. Do you have any tips for dealing with this? It took me 4 months to come up with something that does almost work for this. If you have any tips, I'd love to hear them. It's something that I fear is underlooked when, underlooked? Overlooked in terms of teaching English, and the ing is allowed to settle in. Because of course, the ing starts with the I, that's fantastic, yes, the I is there, but the N and the G aren't N's or G's, it's a completely different sound. I want you to do something gross for me. Sorry. I start, every time I talk to a woman, that's what I start with. I would like you, at the bottom of your mouth, just underneath your tongue, to feel there's a tiny fleshy bump. I call it a protuberance because that's gross. So, can you feel that fleshy protuberance with your tongue? Just underneath at the bottom of your mouth. Right there. Yep. What I want you to do is I want you to not put your tongue directly on it. Slide your tongue back until the tip of your tongue is just touching it. And then I want you to just voice. I sound ridiculous. But this is where your tongue should be. You don't need to zoom in. I can't show them the inside of my mouth, I'm sorry. A little bit gross. But this is where you will find that perfect sweet spot of tongue placement for you to pronounce ing wonderfully. And all it requires from then is just the simple opening of your mouth and not too much stress. Walking, going. Here we have a little tongue twister of sorts to keep your tongue in that place. I want you to, every time this word comes up, slide back your tongue and put it right there where we discussed, right where the tip of your tongue is about to touch that fleshy protuberance. Walking while waiting and going is trapping your thinking. right? Good job, everybody. I hope you're following at home alone, or else I just look ridiculous. Let's go on. Question time. So the questions we have here are what are some strategies you personally found useful with accent training? And on the opposite side, what are some English pronunciations that you don't understand? Of course, you are hopefully English teachers or English learners, and I'd like to know what things just don't make sense to you. And while we're here, I am going to look at the questions that we've been getting throughout, answer them for you, and let's do that. Yeah, and now you can see all of me and my really poorly fitting blazer. I need a new one. Okay, so your air pronunciation, that is something that highly depends on the word. English is unfortunately unstandardized. Now, so many languages of the world were standardized in pronunciation. Russian, of course, after the revolution, Chinese after their revolution, German after their revolution, and French after its revolution. I see a theme here. The problem is the English Revolution happened about 400 years ago, and they weren't exactly thinking about pronunciation at that time. So English never got standardized, and this can be seen mostly in the various regional dialectal differences that come up again and again. Of course, I am born in New Zealand to South African parents, but grew up in Australia with an English educator and American TV. All of them sounded very different, but we're still speaking the same language. And that, if we're bringing it on a broader spectrum, can be applied to words in general. Air is something that cannot actually be discussed. And I'm sorry to disappoint you, but it completely depends on the word. For example, air, as in the air we breathe, is pronounced almost exactly the same way as to of course, to is just to make a mistake. And this is pronounced in America exactly the same as air, which is what we breathe, and is spelled A-I-R. It highly depends on the word, and there are no standard forms. Sorry. John, what about linking R in year after year in most parts of England? In most parts of England. In most parts of England, of course, as I said, they will use the non-rhotic R. So year after year. So as for that pronunciation, as I think that's what the question is, from Maria Tolpiga? Tolpiga. My Russian reading is terrible, sorry. So for understanding how to pronounce that, it is simply an think of it as a very light A that's more pronounced. So here, your ear, year after year. And for understanding that in a more simple, a more directive context, remember what we just did with the tongue placement in the ing. I would recommend putting your tongue in that exact same space and then going for an ah. So here. But yeah, so linking R in year after year in most parts of England. As for that, realistically, it doesn't matter where your accent comes from as long as you can say it, we'll all understand you. So the sounds, yes, the dental fricatives are very difficult for our children. Of course, and I think this came before I described them, but yes, they are going to be, no matter what, the most difficult part of English to understand. And this just comes with constant exercise because it is a foreign position. It's not the sound that's the problem, it's the positioning of your mouth. And if you train that in your children, if you impress that upon them, it becomes a non-issue. It's quite simply. The more you exercise it, the more they will understand it, the more they will grow accustomed to it. It is simply a practice-based exercise. Once you know where to put the muscles in your mouth, once you know where to put your tongue and your teeth, it will always work well. And it's simple after that point. There will be a steep learning curve. That is something that you cannot change. It is a steep learning curve moving from, I went to the market, or I went to the market, and then changing that, I went to the market. right, with the confluence of tongue and teeth, not found in Russian. Sorry, exercise. One of my learners has a problem with the sound g. There's a problem with the sound g. Okay, I am so sorry. Ekaterina, I am very sorry. Could you please clarify if that is the G or the more Russian G? I assume you mean the G, and I'll help you with that now. Actually, I don't want to cause confusion. Could you please post another question and ask if that is the G or the J, or where that, or the G, or where that fits into everything, just so we can clarify and not waste everybody's time. Finally, problems with NG. So is that what we just discussed with the ing, the ing? Or I think that is problems with NG. I'm sorry, that's not, Irina, I'm sorry, that's not very descriptive. But I hope I just answered your question with that tongue placement that we just did, the very weird finding that fleshy bit in the bottom of your mouth and putting the tip of your tongue just on that as you slide your tongue backward, and that will help you produce the that we get. Also, I should clarify that if you wish to pronounce it a bit more, I would ask your students to smile as wide as they can while they do it. Just to impress upon them the importance of the cheeks in that scenario. Speaking of cheeks, Rosie, thank you for the lighting. Okay, so thank you very much. That was a brief question time. The questions in response to this which we've just discussed now, please post them and I'll take a look at them at the end. And Yekaterina, could you please clarify exactly what kind of G sound that is? And I'll take a look at all that at the end. If you have absolutely any more questions about me or anything else to do with pronunciation or anything to do with English in and of itself or English ethnography, please feel free to ask, because I feel we'll have quite some time at the end. So let us get through. But, ha! This is my favorite. This is my favorite. This is something that I took a lot of time to construct after I figured out there were inherent problems associated with the way Russians look at words. Now, Russians, of course, are built around the concept of pronounce every letter in any which way you do so. And it's a fantastic system because it makes a lot more sense than the English one, which is, guess, buddy, tough to be you. This is English now. Everything is pain. God, I hate this language. So, rather self-hating native speaker, aren't I? So, let's look at what I mean when I say it's all in your head and why Russians read words problematically. So, Russians, when they look at words, don't think about them in the way that English speakers do. English speakers will look at a word and understand the construction of it. Because not only do we know the rules, which we are taught in school, but we understand that this is probably a word that we've heard before or we can compare to. And is a comparative understanding, which we take to understanding what we're reading. Russians, who are learning English, don't have that luxury. And so they always get stuck, and they look at a word and they try to figure it out. Now, this is, of course, a huge problem with GH. Because this is something that could mean laugh or trough, but could also mean through and though. Awful. So Russians, when confronted with language constructs, just get stuck. And it's difficult for them to work through it. This is a tactic that I figured out with the mekiznak. Now the mekiznak is used in Russian in a beautiful, wonderful way. It's a stunting vowel. Do you consider it a vowel? I don't know. It is a stunting letter that will pull everything a little bit together. Not only does it move the tongue to the roof of your mouth, which is its intended purpose, but when Russians see it, they close, especially if they're speaking English. It's this marvelous thing that the Russian brain does when they're reading a word, and of course they're pronouncing English with the big open mouth, and I'm making myself look ridiculous. But the mekiznak pulls it all together. I've had so much trouble with thought, of getting the o. Because of course the Russians have the o, have the or. If you want to sound like a Russian, every time something unfortunate happens, just go or. It's marvelous. But getting the English o and or and closing the mouth and bringing that together and then switching to a consonant is very difficult for Russian speakers. But it's all in their head, they can do it. With the addition of the mekiznak at the end, I highly recommend using this for students who are having a bit more trouble, or at least the first few times, just to understand, just to allow them to understand the way the mouth will close and be as mobile as it is in this language. Because of course, we're translating a very immobile language to a very mobile language. So, although the thought, I think they thought, was fraught with this and that, I think the thought was nothing but a thought that wrought just about naught. They don't need to pronounce all the other words right. They don't even need to know what they mean. This is an exercise to exercise their mouth movement in a bit more flexible way, just by cheating a little bit and using a mekiznak. Now, let's move on to something really silly. This is something for A1 students. A1 students, for some reason, can't put letters together. Why? Well, it's very simple, though we would consider ridiculous. My hands are all over the place. As we said, in Russian, every letter is taken in turn. And of course, when you speak it fluently, you get to mix and match and blend sounds ever so slightly. But in English, when you're first learning English, it is still very much an understanding based off the letter-based system. Makes sense. The problem is, a lot of English letters don't work on their own. I get a lot of A1 students going hurtus or thoughtus, liketus, because it's staggering for them. Take away the stagger. Show them that ts is just like the Russian tse. Did I say that right? Tse? Thank you. I got a very tall thumb just from behind a computer screen. Just whoa! It's like the Addams Family. Did you guys ever watch the Addams Family? You're probably too shy to answer me. But Addams Family, terrible show. So this is a simple tool. Now, of course, there is. I can hear you telling me right away, Stephen Brett Ligofff, we are English teachers. We cannot cross-pollinate with such a fetid language as Russian. Oh. Tough. If it helps A1 students learn the sound, why not? They understand that this is not how they actually do it. They are not going to write H-U-R-tse when they're writing hertz. This is just an exercise to promote them to work around the staggering aspect when they're first learning the language. And it works wonders for their confidence. English is terrifying. It has it has between 8 and 15 times the amount of words that Russian does, depending who's counting. It has linguistic constructs that make no sense and are terrifying to Russians, especially if you are a beginner, especially if you are a child beginner. This is something that boosts their confidence marvelously and allows them just that, as we say in Yiddish, the chutzpah, the will to keep on working on it. And this is something that I use with all of my students if they display these problems. So, details. Now, this is something that is for you, moreover. Now, this is something that I've constructed piece by piece over my year here from people asking me the difference between two different vowel constructs. Now, the first one, it started with beer and bear. And it was from my dear friend, Masha. Masha speaks perfect English. She is currently reading Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman's Good Omens, which is a level of English that I speak when I speak to native speakers. It's impossible. She's reading that and understanding it and doing marvelously. Her accent, however, is very, very, very strong. Now, this details galore aspect, lesson number 8, is something for those people who have mastered the art of speaking English but are still worried about those fickle little bits of their pronunciation that get caught up in the mix. And this, as mentioned, is more than for teachers. And I would hope that this is something that you take home with you. Now, just in the way that I said "Здравствуйте" more times than there are days that I have been alive, probably, my math isn't very good. I'm an ethnographer and historian and English teacher, not a mathematician, I'm sorry. But over 5,000 times I said "Здравствуйте" so I could work out the sounds. These are things that I hope you will be standing in the shower repeating to yourself with your wife or your husband next to you, just thinking you're absolutely mad. Let's take a look at them. Now, some of them that could be easily translated into a Russian pronunciation are there, as you can see. You are not blind. I am sorry for bringing that up so late. I feel like a moron. So, and I'm not belittling you. I'm sorry. They're just there. Anyway, so beer, bear. Now, listen to that. Beer, bear. You have that little upstroke of the E. Beer, and then bear. And following on from that, of understanding the different realms of intonation, you have he's and his. Now that difference is a little bit more subtle, but if you look at it, it's easy to pick apart. He's, and then his. Very short, very sharp, eh. And a lot of these vowel differences are that different, are the difference that I just mentioned between beer and bear and he's and his. Is the difference between the flat line, e or e, and then the upstroke of e or e. So, beer, bear. He's, his. All right. Now the next one is something that I often get asked is her and hair. Now that one is simply of what we call, what I like to call a somersault. Her, and then hair of the upstroke little bap. Now this one is terrible because they are pronounced exactly the same, but the difference lies in intonation, and this is something, of course, that you as Russians are very aware of using intonation to shape your sentences. However, we are going to look at it in English, and nothing brings me more joy than torturing Russians with intonation. Ha! I get you back. So, oh sorry, you can't point in Russian. I get you back. Cool. So, hour. I just said the same word. Hour. I just said the same word. Intonation. Hour. Our friend is missing. We have 1 hour left. Simple as that. The difference between the upstroke and the downstroke in your intonation. Very simple, but very difficult to remember, to retain. And yes, it is noticeable. These are things, these are word pairings that, of course, are similar, but obviously different. But they are things that will be picked up by native speakers. I chose them specifically because if you do not latch onto them, they will get away from you. Once and once. And that's something that Russians can simply do. And I'm sorry for replacing the w with an u in Russian there, but there's no w sound in Russian, as previously discussed. Once and once. And that's a much more subtle difference. But if you really hit that T, once, as that xie, and then you hit the once, makes perfect sense. This and these, now that's one that's very obvious, and something that you have all, as teachers, practiced again and again and again and again and again. This, these. But it is something that when you speak quickly, you will mess up. This is something that I have never seen a Russian really hit without practice, because of course they're very similar sounding, and the stretching of the E is lost in speed. So please just practice that. And finally, bad, bed. And of course, again, difference in the upstroke, bad, and then a low stroke, bed. I think I've explained them relatively well, but here's the thing. They are not something to just work on once. As I mentioned, these are the things that you practice in your free time. When you're driving, when you're on the metro, when you're talking to yourself, when you're in the shower, again and again and again and again and again. Be neurotic. I want you to really hit these home, because these words, these pairings, and these little differences in vowel value are what set you apart in the shibboleth sense from native speakers as Russian, if you don't master them. And let's go on to something weird. I love this. So something that is plaguing Russians in Russian presence, Russian understanding, Russian perception in the West is the Russian monotone. You speak very flat. And in the klukva, in the movies, in the Hollywood movies, will always never emote as they speak. It is constantly flat. This is something that English speakers will always pick up, always. Because this is the Russian thing. You guys speak like you're dying to the English ear. Now, of course, as I've learned more Russian and as I've been here longer, and as every expat has been here and understood that there is a lot of inherent rhythm and monotone and depth and diphthongs and exercise within just movement within a Russian sentence. The problem is Russians, as I've said before, are a lot more audibly, are a lot more detail-oriented than the Englishmen. So we don't hear that. We just hear flatline Russian. English, on the other hand, as you've heard throughout today, is very much full of the ups and downs and the emotions and the depth, the value of all those bits and pieces of your sentences that you throw together, and it's almost like you're singing a very bad song, because I am tone deaf and I am terrible at singing. When I was in high school in music class, they didn't give me an instrument to play or any lines to sing. I got 2 sticks to bang together like a chimpanzee. It was great. Enough about me failing in high school. Rhythm. English rhythm is something that is not taught. And you will always get people speaking English in Russian, and it always sounds exactly the same. Depth to your vowels follows a very simple system. Up and down, up and down, up and down. But a lot less rigid. Think of it more as loops. Now, this is a phrase that was conjured by a friend of mine who is also an English teacher. And she said, hey, this would be pretty good for rhythm training. I said, yes, it would be pretty good for rhythm training. Now I use it on all of my students. Now repeat after me and follow the finger. Weird phrase. I went to Hunter Valley once. I really liked the cheeses there. You see? Up and down and spinning as it goes, and that's how we speak English. I went to Hunter Valley once. I really liked the cheeses there. And so that speed followed by stress at the end of every word or at every second word is usually how you find that basic rhythm within English. And as you build that rhythm, then you can play with it and it becomes natural. This is something that will be learned by your students in a very short amount of time. Because if I'm honest, it's very simple to grasp. Just emote your sentences in terms of giving them a little bit of life. Up and down and up and down and up and down. I went to Hunter Valley once. I really liked the cheeses there. Cool. Also, I hope you're all writing these down or have access to them after the fact, because I've given a lot of homework exercises for you in terms of teaching practice. I hope you've got those to go, because if not, I'm sorry. I don't know how this system works. Okay. Bop. This is, we're closing up now, we're almost done. I won't keep any more of your time. I am sorry I have kept you this long and wasted so much of your day talking to little old me. It must be very boring. So there are 2 things in English that Russians will always think are exactly the same as they are in Russian. They're not. So this is very short. I'm going to cut through this quite quickly. They're not the same, and they make you sound terrible. And these are 2 of the greatest problems I have among Russian speakers. So, let me explain interesting to you. So in Russian, you have интересно. I said that wrong. Did I say that right? Thank you. Интересно. Интересно. Sorry, been speaking English for an hour and a bit. Russian not coming to me today. So you, of course, will translate this into interesting, which technically does work very well in English. Yes, interesting. Say, I think that this would be very interesting for you. Perfect. Technically, it is fine. But technically, when a native English speaker comes to Russia and he, instead of saying okay or that's fine or that's good, he says хорошо. Хорошо is used much less frequently in Russian than when a native English speaker is trying to speak Russian, because every third sentence will have a хорошо in it. This is a problem, and Russian speakers will always bring you up on not saying хорошо. Please, it's overused. This is exactly the same with interesting. Instead of interesting, try explaining yourself further, because interesting is an adjective only in English. Technically, it's not. Colloquially, it is. And so you will always find yourself a little bit out of the bag and a little bit out in the open if you don't, if you overuse this word. Instead, as I mentioned before, try explaining yourself further. So instead of saying, this would be interesting for you, say this business offer, this would be interesting for you, say, I think you'd like this. Or this could be quite interesting, using it as an adjective. This could be quite interesting. Or, I think that this shows promise, let's look at it further. Just more words, I'm sorry, but interesting is not a shortcut in English. Finally, normal, нормально. Нормально is a great Russian word. Of course, famously during the siege and bombardment of the Kremlin in 1994? 1993? I think 1994. There was a Russian soldier, and a reporter comes to him and says, holds a microphone to his face and says, how is everything going? What's the situation on the ground? Is everything going fine? And just before he can respond, cannon fire from a BMP, I forgot my Soviet military history, from the cannon just behind him, blasts the Kremlin. And he ducks, the soldier, he gets his helmet, looks around, stands up and says, "Всё нормально." Love it, beautiful. Best word in Russian, by far, except for небеса ежик. I love ежик. So, нормально, great word in Russian. It doesn't work in English. Of course, this is something that you will encounter very frequently with A1 speakers, and it's something that, please, I beg of you, don't let it fester. Because if it festers, if your students keep on repeating it, they will not give it up. And it's very simple to fix. So for example, I ask, how are you? If you say, I'm normal. No, you're not normal. You're fine, right? Or if you ask, how's your father? How are you doing with your work? Normal is never an answer to anything that could be, to anything that begins with how. How and как are not the same. Ostensibly, they are. Colloquially, they're not. So if you can answer нормально to any question that has been asked with the preface of как in Russian, if you ask how in English, you cannot follow it up with an answer that involves normal. Simple. Boop. Think simple. This is something that I stress to a lot of my students, and I'm sorry. It's a very simple principle that I'm just going to give to you. Russian is a conceptual language. What we get so frequently are Russian speakers who are brilliant in Russian. The way they speak, the way they understand the world around them, they could be demagogues for anything that you let them. They can talk the back legs off a donkey in Russian. In English, it is always the oohs, ahs, and сейчас. Always among Russian intellectuals, the intelligentsia, you will always get pauses. And it's something that in the West we do accuse Russians of. Why? Russian is a conceptual language. Beautifully so. My favorite word in Russian, as I mentioned before, небеса. Right? The heavens, sure, but no demons. Cool, great, perfect. English doesn't work that way. Russian is all about the concepts, the ideas, the esoteric, bigger picture of the thing. And when you try and speak like that in English and find translations for the words you're trying to use in English, they don't exist. English is a very simple language to a Russian, because instead of having concepts and ideas as the basis of your understanding of the language, it is very much about building a picture. It is illustrative. It is about who, why, when, where, what, how. In the sense that you are building and illustrating an image of what you are trying to convey, as opposed to the Russian who tries to build the idea, and of course it is also quite an inferential language. English has a lot more joining words in that sense. Regardless, very simply, don't worry. Speak simple. You will get away speaking simply in English because it's a much more simple, arguably dumber language. So, don't overthink it. And finally, thank you so much for coming. I hope you've taken away something from today. Now we're going to answer some questions. But before I do, thank you so much for coming today and sitting with me and hopefully not getting bored. Or if you are getting bored, that's the appropriate response. You're not a sociopath. But I hope you've learned something. And if you personally have not learned something, I hope you've learned some takeaways for your students and some wonderful little exercises to help you, if not be a better teacher, then be a better speaker. Now, let's look at some questions. Okay. So I remember the awful moment when I met the word, oh good lord, schedule, the first time. There are no other problems with pronunciation. I absolutely agree. Schedule is a horrible. But do you mean in terms of the American schedule or the British schedule? Because that's a nightmare. Schedule. Ugh. Sorry, on behalf of the entire English language, I apologize. So, next, okay, my pupil speaks G as the wide Russian sound. The wide Russian sound. So the G, like alcohol, for example. So for the G, I personally, you'll find this weird, I was born with a speech impediment, meaning I couldn't speak properly until I was 3 or 4 years old. And that's why I got interested in understanding how speech works. So what I do, if he has that kind of problem, maybe what helped me would help him. What I would recommend is using the side of his mouth, the J. So your tongue, just goes in your cheek, just behind your molars, and J. So it's almost like the J or the J that you would find in... Actually, yeah, no, let's use that. So it's almost like the J that you would find in Russian, so zhenya, for example. But instead of going the J and stretching it, just go J. Just go J. So instead of the stretch, just J. And hopefully that'll allow him to build that kind of muscle memory with that side of his mouth, because that's the best way to do it. If he's still stuck in the middle of his mouth using the Russian G, simply ask him to switch to the side, and hopefully that'll expand his repertoire. It's quite a difficult question, and you can see me working through it, trying to think of an exercise. But I think just showing him that, put his tongue in the same place as he would for the Russian zh, and that should work wonders. What about often and often? Right, so the often and often is a purely regional thing, or even personal. It's like escape. There's often escape and escape. It's the same word, you're just stressing different vowels. So often in English, perfectly fine. Often in English, perfectly fine. The often is a bit more posh, as we'd say. It's a bit more fancy English, but often is perfectly acceptable. In terms of pronunciation, I would even err on the side of often, because it's easier to pronounce, because the vowels are a bit more pronounced in that sense, and it's a bit more comfortable for Russian speakers, I assume. And it is a lot more colloquial. It's more welcoming and shows you to have an affinity for the language that goes beyond its base structure. Of course, silent letters are always a problem in English because it's a terrible language who hasn't solved its own problems. But often, please, use it liberally. There's no right answer to that. So do whatever you like. I would err on the side of often. So in some books we use to teach our students, we have a so-so to the question, how are you? I know that's not very English to answer this way. What do you think about this? Thank you. Thank you so much for bringing that up. So, yeah, in Russian you have chut-chut, right? Like a little for that. In English, so-so. So-so is an answer, and as you quite rightly said, Maria, thank you very much. Yes, not English at all. So-so is something that you would give to a complicated, is an answer that you would give to a complicated question if they are answering a complicated answer and you can't give them the definite description. So I would quite possibly, of course, let me be perfectly frank here, of course, oh God, that was very South African of me. Don't trust Russian textbooks so much. There are always going to be problems found within. Even British textbooks, I often have problems with British textbooks, but regardless, so-so, I would not use it at all. I would, if there are problems found within a textbook, there is no shame in telling your students that that's wrong and correcting them and correcting the textbook in front of them. Yes, the textbook is law, but you aren't the first law, I suppose. If that's the law, you're the president, and we know how autocracy works in Russia. So, I would, instead of using so-so, use the ones that we told before. I'm fine, or I'm good, or I've been doing well. The most English way is say, I've been well. Because, I don't know, British people just love to be well. So, to that end, I would say well, or fine, or good. But I think that's the end of our questions, and I hope I've answered all of them to a satisfactory degree. If I've not, you can yell at me later. You can find where I live, track me down, and light some fires. That's fine. I rent. I don't own my apartment, so if it gets set on fire, not my problem. If I'm inside, stay warm through the winter. So track me down, set fire to me. Thank you so much for coming and listening to me rant about useless stuff today. I hope you've learned something for you or for your students. Have a wonderful day. Stay warm. Praise the last few rays of sun we have this year. Savor them and enjoy the winter. I hope to see you soon if I'm ever allowed back here and they haven't kicked me out of the studio yet. So, take care.